The 1970s were the Wild West of horror cinema. Studios were taking risks, directors pushed boundaries, and audiences were shocked in ways they'd never seen before. Everyone remembers The Exorcist, everyone knows Halloween, but hidden in the shadows were other nightmares, movies that slipped through the cracks, forgotten by the mainstream, yet still powerful enough to send chills down your spine today. Some were too strange, some too bleak, some too disturbing for mass audiences, but for true horror fans, they became whispered legends. So today, we're digging them up. 15 forgotten horror films of the 1970s that still terrify decades later. And trust me, some of these will haunt you more than the classics. Number 15. Nosferatu the Vampire, 1979. Vampires had been on screen for decades, but in 1979, German director Werner Herzog resurrected one of cinema's oldest nightmares. His remake of the silent classic Nosferatu wasn't flashy, it wasn't romantic, it was slow, methodical, and absolutely drenched in dread. The story feels familiar. Jonathan Harker travels to a remote castle. He meets Count Dracula, and soon, the vampire's shadow spreads across the town. But Herzog stripped away all Hollywood glamour. There's no charming aristocrat, no gothic romance, just a diseased alien predator creeping through every frame. Klaus Kinski plays the Count, and his performance is unforgettable. Bald, pale, rat-like teeth and long claws, every gesture is unnatural, every glance feels venomous. Unlike Christopher Lee or Bela Lugosi, this Dracula isn't seductive, he is pure death in human form. The imagery is haunting, a ship drifting silently into harbor full of rats, a town overrun by plague with coffins carried through empty streets, a dinner table where survivors celebrate as if tomorrow will never come, and Dracula himself, wandering like a shadow of inevitable doom. When it was released, Nosferatu the Vampire didn't explode at the box office. It wasn't a mainstream hit. Audiences at the time wanted slashers like Halloween. Herzog's pacing felt too slow, too strange, but critics noticed its artistry. They praised the atmosphere, the cinematography, and Kinski's terrifying presence. It was horror as high art. Over the decades, its reputation grew. Film scholars call it one of Herzog's masterpieces. Kinski's Dracula became an icon of European horror, and the film influenced later directors who wanted horror to feel poetic, not just shocking. Why does it still terrify today? Because it doesn't rely on jump scares, it doesn't shout or scream, it creeps, it suffocates. It convinces you that death is slow, inescapable, and already in the room. Nosferatu the Vampire may not be as famous as The Exorcist or The Shining, but for those who stumble upon it, it's unforgettable. A forgotten nightmare that still lingers more than 40 years later. And if this haunting vision of Dracula unsettled you, the next forgotten film turns family trauma into a monster you'll never forget. Number 14. The Brood, 1979. By the late 1970s, horror was dominated by slashers. Knives, masks, and teenage screams filled the theaters. But David Cronenberg had something else in mind. He wasn't interested in masked killers, he was interested in the body. And in The Brood, he turned the human body into a weapon of raw emotion. The film takes place in a remote clinic. Dr. Raglan, played by Oliver Reed, uses experimental therapy. Patients are told to externalize their emotions, not just talk about them, manifest them. And one patient takes it too far. Samantha Eggar plays Nola Carveth, a woman consumed by rage and trauma. Her anger doesn't just stay inside, it creates life. Horrifying, twisted, childlike creatures. They crawl out of her body in one of the most shocking birth scenes ever filmed. These monsters, deformed and sexless, act as her rage-made flesh. They stalk the people who hurt her. They kill without hesitation. The imagery is unforgettable. Small killers in winter coats bludgeoning a teacher to death in front of her students. A mother tearing open a bloody sack to lick her grotesque offspring. It's not just disturbing, it's deeply unsettling because it feels symbolic. And that's where Cronenberg's genius lies. This wasn't just shock for shock's sake. He wrote The Brood during his own bitter divorce and custody battle. The film became a metaphor for toxic relationships and the destructive power of rage. The creatures weren't just monsters, they were Nola's emotions, her pain, her fury, brought into the physical world. Critics at the time were divided. Some called it exploitation trash, others recognized its brilliance as psychological horror. Even Cronenberg later admitted it was one of his most personal films, And Samantha Eggar's fearless performance, chilling, unhinged, unforgettable, cemented the movie's impact. Today, The Brood is considered a cult masterpiece. It's studied as a perfect example of body horror. Meta, Cis, Sex 0.05. It influenced later filmmakers who explored the thin line between emotion and flesh. And it proved that horror didn't have to be about masked killers. It could be about the horrors inside us. Why does it still terrify? Because it connects horror to something universal. We all know anger. We all fear losing control. The Brood makes that fear real, visible, and violent. And if rage-born children haunt your nightmares, the next forgotten horror takes surreal terror to an entirely new dimension. Number 13, Phantasm, 1979. Some horror films tell a story, but Phantasm feels more like a dream, or rather, a nightmare you can't wake from. Directed by Don Coscarelli, this low-budget indie was unlike anything else in 1979. It wasn't polished, it wasn't safe, but it was imaginative, surreal, and terrifying. The plot starts simply enough. Two brothers stumble onto strange happenings at a funeral home. Inside the mausoleum lurks the Tall Man, played by Angus Scrimm. Tall, gaunt with an icy stare, his very presence feels unnatural. He doesn't chase, he glides. He doesn't scream, he whispers, and that's somehow worse. But the Tall Man isn't the only nightmare here. This film is full of bizarre, unforgettable imagery. Silver spheres fly through the air, drilling into skulls and spraying blood across marble floors. Corpses are stolen from graves, then shrunk down and transformed into hooded dwarves, enslaved for another dimension. The rules of reality collapse. Nothing makes sense, and that's exactly the point. Audiences in 1979 didn't know what to make of it. Some critics dismissed it as incoherent nonsense, but others recognized the brilliance in its dreamlike atmosphere. With just $300,000, Coscarelli created a horror world that felt vast, surreal, and terrifying. And Angus Scrimm became an instant horror icon, his Tall Man one of the most chilling villains of the decade. The cast added to the cult charm. A. Michael Baldwin as Mike, the curious younger brother, and Reggie Bannister as the guitar-playing ice cream man turned reluctant hero. They weren't Hollywood stars, but they felt real people you could know, suddenly trapped in the bizarre. Phantasm wasn't a mainstream hit, but it found its audience. Midnight screenings, word of mouth, and cult fans turned it into a phenomenon. It spawned 4 sequels, each stranger than the last, and its influence spread across the horror genre, inspiring filmmakers who wanted to capture that same waking dream sensation. Why does it still terrify today? Because you can't explain it. It's not about logic, it's about the feeling of reality dissolving around you. It taps into childhood fears, death, the graveyard, the idea that adults hide secrets too big to understand. More than 40 years later, the Silver Sphere still makes fans shiver, and the Tall Man still towers over horror history. And if Phantasm made you question reality itself, the next forgotten film turns roadside Americana into a terrifying death trap. Number 12. Tourist Trap 1979. On the surface, it looks like a simple slasher, but Tourist Trap is stranger, creepier, and far more unsettling than most films of its time. Directed by David Schmoller, this 1979 gem takes place in the middle of nowhere, where a group of young travelers breaks down near a roadside attraction. Instead of friendly souvenirs, they find something horrifying, a collection of life-sized mannequins that seem just a little too alive. Chuck Connors plays Mr. Slauson, the kindly old man who offers to help. At first he feels harmless, almost fatherly, but his smile hides something twisted. Because Mr. Slauson has a gift, he can move objects with his mind, and in his crumbling museum, the mannequins don't just sit still. They watch, they breathe, sometimes they even kill. The imagery is unforgettable, a mannequin head turning suddenly to scream, blank faces cracking open to reveal lifeless eyes, victims wrapped in plaster, suffocating as they become part of the display. It's part slasher, part supernatural nightmare, and the mix keeps viewers constantly off balance. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as another low-budget horror cash-in, but others noticed its bizarre originality. Connors, known mainly as a TV cowboy, shocked audiences with his unhinged performance. His shifts between friendly host and sadistic killer are genuinely terrifying. What makes Tourist Trap still effective today is its atmosphere. The film oozes dread, with sound design that uses whispers, laughter, and eerie voices to make the mannequins feel alive. The soundtrack alone can make your skin crawl, and unlike many slashers of the era, this one feels unpredictable. You never know if the next room hides another mannequin or something far worse. Over time, the movie built a cult following. Horror fans praised it as one of the most underrated films of the 70s. #meta. Pause. Sex 0.05, and modern directors cite it as an influence for blending psychological terror with supernatural flair. It never reached the fame of Halloween or Friday the 13th, but in many ways it's scarier, because it feels so strange, so dreamlike, almost like a forgotten nightmare trapped in celluloid. Why does it still terrify today? Because mannequins are already unsettling, lifeless imitations of people, and Schmoller turned that unease into pure horror. Watching Tourist Trap feels like being stuck in a nightmare roadside museum where escape is impossible. It's weird, it's creepy, and it sticks with you long after the credits roll. And if lifeless mannequins coming to life made your skin crawl, the next forgotten horror goes even darker, feeding on primal fears of isolation and survival. Number 11. Eaten Alive 1977. After shocking the world with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, director Tobe Hooper returned with something even stranger, a fever dream of violence called Eaten Alive. Set in the swamps of Texas, the film follows a rundown motel run by Judd, played by Neville Brand. Judd isn't just a creepy caretaker, he's a deranged killer with a taste for blood, and he happens to keep a giant crocodile just outside his motel as his personal disposal system. The story unfolds like a nightmare. Guests arrive one by one, hoping for a safe place to sleep, and almost all of them end up butchered by Judd or dragged into the jaws of his hungry reptile. What makes it disturbing isn't just the kills, but the atmosphere. The entire film feels sweaty, claustrophobic, and delirious, as if the viewer is trapped in the same hellish swamp. Hooper shot much of it on sound stages, which gave everything an artificial, dreamlike quality. The sets look real, but not quite right, like a twisted carnival version of reality. Neville Brandt's performance as Judd is unhinged, muttering, pacing, and snapping at anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. He feels unpredictable, capable of exploding at any second, and that makes every scene terrifying. Supporting roles add to the cult appeal, with appearances by a young Robert Englund years before he became Freddy Krueger and horror veteran Mel Ferrer. The kills are gruesome, but it's the surreal pacing that lingers. Judd rambling nonsensically, the crocodile thrashing in the water, victims screaming in the shadows. When the film was released, critics were confused. Some dismissed it as exploitation trash, while others noticed its bizarre, nightmarish style. It didn't find mainstream success like Chainsaw, but over the years it gained cult status among horror fans who appreciated its raw, unsettling energy. Today, Eaten Alive is remembered less for its story and more for its mood. This feels like watching a hallucination captured on film, sweaty, disorienting, and cruel. Hooper proved again that he could create horror not just with gore, but with an oppressive sense of unease. Why does it still terrify? Because it takes something familiar, like a roadside motel, and twists it into a place of madness. Because it turns a crocodile, usually a distant threat, into a living embodiment of death just outside the door. And because Judd himself, babbling and broken, feels like a man you could actually meet on a lonely highway night. Eaten Alive may not have the fame of Chainsaw, but it's just as unsettling, maybe even stranger. And if this swamp nightmare made you uneasy, the next forgotten film drives terror straight into suburbia with 4 wheels and no mercy. Number 10. The Car, 1977. In the late 1970s, audiences were terrified by sharks, haunted houses, and masked killers. But then came a horror film about something far more ordinary, something parked right outside your home. Car. Directed by Elliot Silverstein, The Car tells the story of a small desert town stalked by a black, driverless automobile. There's no explanation of where it came from, no backstory, no origin. It just appears on the highway, a sleek, rumbling monster on 4 wheels, and it kills anyone who crosses its path. The setup is simple, yet it's strangely effective. The sheriff's department scrambles to stop the mysterious vehicle as it plows through cyclists, pedestrians, and even police roadblocks. James Brolin stars as the town's sheriff, a man completely outmatched by this supernatural machine. His performance grounds the insanity, portraying a lawman desperate to protect his people from something he can't fight with bullets or handcuffs. What makes The Car stand out is its atmosphere. The desert landscapes feel endless, making every chase sequence feel like a battle in the middle of nowhere. The sound design adds to the terror. The roar of the engine, the blare of the horn, the screech of tires that sound almost animalistic. Unlike Jaws, where the shark was hidden for suspense, the car is always visible, always coming, and that inevitability makes it scarier. Critics at the time were divided. Some laughed at the absurd premise, calling it a B-movie with an overblown budget. Others admitted it had a strange hypnotic power. While it didn't earn the respect of prestige horror, it connected with audiences who loved the blend of supernatural menace and everyday vulnerability. Over the years, it developed a cult following, particularly among fans of killer object horror. Its DNA can be seen in later films like Christine by John Carpenter, where another vehicle becomes the embodiment of evil. Even Stephen King admitted that the car paved the way for stories about machines with malevolent intent. Why does it still terrify today? Because cars are everywhere. They're part of our daily lives. They represent freedom, safety, routine. And the car twists that comfort into something lethal. It reminds you that even the most ordinary object can become a weapon of death. The film may not be as polished as Jaws or as iconic as Halloween, but its imagery, a black sedan barreling down a dusty road with no driver, still sticks in the mind decades later. Watching it feels like being chased by inevitability itself, and no matter how fast you run, the headlights are always behind you. And if a driverless car made you shiver, the next forgotten horror movie takes you into a haunted house filled with scientific experiments and pure supernatural dread. Number 9. The Sentinel, 1977. In the mid-1970s, horror was obsessed with the supernatural, but while audiences were terrified by The Exorcist and The Omen, another film slipped under the radar that was just as disturbing. Directed by Michael Winner, The Sentinel tells the story of a young model named Allison, played by Christina Rains, who moves into a beautiful Brooklyn brownstone. At first, the apartment seems perfect, but things quickly unravel. Strange noises echo through the halls, neighbors act bizarre, and Allison begins to suspect that something dark lives within the walls. Her suspicions are correct because the building isn't just an apartment complex, it's a literal gateway to hell. At the top floor sits a blind priest silently watching over the portal, and Allison slowly realizes she has been chosen to take his place as the next sentinel, guarding humanity from the horrors waiting beyond. The cast is packed with familiar faces, including Christopher Walken, Burgess Meredith, and even a young Jeff Goldblum, which makes the bizarre events feel eerily grounded in reality. The imagery is what makes The Sentinel unforgettable. Hallways filled with grotesque figures, sudden apparitions, and a shocking climax that uses real people with severe physical deformities to portray demons. This choice sparked controversy, with critics accusing the film of exploitation, but it also gave the movie an unsettling authenticity that lingers long after the credits roll. Critics were sharply divided. Some praised its ambition and atmosphere, comparing it to the great religious horror of the decade, while others condemned it as tasteless and incoherent. Audiences, however, found themselves haunted by its imagery. The sight of Allison's transformation from struggling model to unwilling guardian of the underworld is both tragic and terrifying. What makes the film powerful is the way it blends everyday life with cosmic horror. The apartment looks ordinary, sex 0.05, the neighbors act eccentric but harmless, and yet underneath it all is the eternal struggle between heaven and hell. It's a reminder that evil might not come with fire and brimstone, but instead slip quietly into the cracks of our daily lives. Over time, The Sentinel developed a cult following. Horror fans appreciated its ambition, its ensemble cast, and its willingness to disturb in ways more famous films dared not. While it never achieved the fame of The Exorcist, its legacy endures as one of the strangest, most unsettling horror films of the 1970s. Why does it still terrify today? Because it takes something as ordinary as renting an apartment and twists it into a story about eternal damnation. Because it suggests that fate can choose you, whether you like it or not, to stand against the darkness. And because once you've seen that final descent into hell, you can never unsee it. And if a haunted apartment building wasn't enough to shake you, the next forgotten horror drags us even deeper into madness with a killer inspired by one of the most infamous murderers of all time. Number 8. Deranged, 1974. Long before Hannibal Lecter or Buffalo Bill terrified audiences, there was a quiet, low-budget Canadian film that captured the same horror with chilling realism. Deranged, directed by Jeff Gillen and Alan Ormsby, was loosely inspired by the crimes of Ed Gein, the infamous murderer and grave robber whose twisted life became the basis for Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. Unlike those more famous films, Deranged didn't sensationalize. It portrayed its killer, Ezra Cobb, with disturbing accuracy, and that's what makes it unforgettable. Ezra is played by Roberts Blossom, an actor often cast in eccentric roles, but here he gives a performance so unsettling it feels like you're watching a documentary. Ezra is a lonely, socially awkward farmer who lives under the shadow of his abusive, religiously fanatical mother. When she dies, he cannot let her go. He digs up her body, dresses it, and keeps her at home as if she never left. But his obsession doesn't stop there. Soon, he begins robbing graves for company, creating grotesque trophies from corpses and eventually turning to murder to satisfy his compulsions. The film doesn't rely on jump scares or gore, though it has plenty of shocking moments. What makes it terrifying is its matter-of-fact tone. It opens with a narrator who guides the audience through Ezra's life almost like a true crime report, which gives the horror a sense of authenticity. The rural setting adds to the bleakness. Empty barns, frozen fields, and dimly lit farmhouses make everything feel isolated and hopeless. Critics at the time were horrified by the film's bluntness. Some praised Blossom's chilling performance as one of the most realistic depictions of a serial killer ever put on screen. Others condemned it as too grotesque, too exploitative. Audiences who stumbled upon it often left disturbed, not just by the acts themselves, but by how ordinary Ezra seemed. There were no flashy effects, no exaggerated villainy, just a lonely man descending into madness. Over the years, Deranged earned cult status, largely because it captured something the bigger Hollywood versions avoided. It showed the quiet, suffocating horror of isolation and obsession. It reminded viewers that monsters don't always lurk in shadows or wear masks. Sometimes, they live quietly on a farm, unnoticed until it's too late. Why does it still terrify today? Because it feels real. Because Roberts Blossom makes Ezra sympathetic and monstrous at the same time. Because the film strips away the distance of fiction and forces us to stare directly at human depravity without disguise. Deranged may not have the fame of Psycho or Chainsaw, but in its raw, unsettling way, it's just as powerful. And if watching Ezra Cobb's descent into madness wasn't disturbing enough, the next forgotten horror shows what happens when a soldier comes home from war but doesn't come back alone. Number 7. Death Dream, 1974. Some horror films are scary because of monsters, others because of what they say about real life. And Death Dream, also known as Dead of Night, manages to do both. Directed by Bob Clark, who would later make the holiday classic A Christmas Story, this low-budget 1974 film is one of the most haunting allegories of the Vietnam War ever put on screen. The story begins with a family receiving tragic news. Their son Andy has been killed in combat. The parents are devastated, but that very night, Andy returns home alive. At first, it feels like a miracle, but something is wrong. Andy is cold, distant, and strangely emotionless. He barely speaks, stares into the distance, and seems disconnected from reality. Slowly, his behavior grows more disturbing. He spends long hours sitting silently in his room. He lashes out unpredictably, and soon the truth becomes clear. Andy didn't come back the same. In fact, he didn't come back human at all. Andy is undead, sustained only by drinking blood. His condition worsens as his craving grows, turning him into a monstrous version of the boy his parents once loved. The horror of Death Dream works on two levels. On the surface, it's a chilling zombie-like tale about a soldier returned from the grave, but beneath that, it's a devastating metaphor for the trauma of war. Andy represents the countless young men who return from Vietnam physically alive but emotionally destroyed, strangers to their families and prisoners of what they experienced overseas. Richard Backus, who plays Andy, gives a performance that's terrifying in its quiet intensity. His blank stare, his sudden bursts of violence, his unnerving silence, they make the character feel both tragic and terrifying. Lynn Carlin and John Marley as the grieving parents add heartbreaking realism to the story. Their desperate denial and fragile hope mirror what many families of that era endured. Critics at the time were shocked. Some dismissed it as too bleak. Hat Meta, Sex 0.05, while others recognized it as one of the first true Vietnam horror films, confronting audiences with the war's psychic wounds in a way no straightforward drama dared. Over the years, Death Dream became a cult classic, appreciated not just for its scares but for its emotional depth. Bob Clark proved that horror could carry powerful social commentary, using the supernatural to highlight the pain of an entire generation. Why does it still terrify today? Because it's not just about a vampire-like soldier. It's about loss, grief, and the fear that someone you love can come back changed forever. It's about the unspoken scars that war leaves behind. Scars that never heal. Watching Death Dream is like staring into the eyes of trauma itself, and once you've seen Andy sitting silently in that darkened room, you can't forget it. And if this tale of a soldier's cursed return unsettled you, the next forgotten film twists an ancient legend into one of the most chilling folk horrors of the decade. Number 6. The Wicker Man, 1973. Few horror films feel as strange, beautiful, and terrifying as The Wicker Man. Directed by Robin Hardy, this 1973 British classic is often called the Citizen Kane of folk horror, though for years it was overlooked, butchered in edits, and almost lost to history. The story begins when Sergeant Howie, played by Edward Woodward, travels to a remote Scottish island to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. The townspeople insist the girl never existed, and their odd behaviour immediately feels sinister. But the horror doesn't come from jump scares or gore, it comes from the slow realization that the entire island lives by its own pagan rules. Christopher Lee, in one of his most striking performances, plays Lord Summerisle, the charismatic leader of the community. Unlike the blood-sucking Dracula he was known for, here he is calm, rational, and terrifying precisely because he believes so completely in his faith. The islanders sing folk songs, dance in fields, and celebrate fertility rituals, all while hiding something darker. For Howie, a devout Christian, every encounter is unsettling. Naked rituals in the woods, children learning about fertility gods in school, and villagers speaking in riddles, it all builds an atmosphere of growing dread. The film's climax is legendary. After uncovering the truth, Howie is lured into a massive wooden effigy, the Wicker Man itself. As the townspeople chant and sing, the structure is set on fire, sacrificing him to ensure the island's crops will flourish. His screams echo as the flames rise, and the villagers rejoice in song. It's one of the most disturbing endings in horror history, precisely because it feels inevitable. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. Some praised its originality, while others dismissed it as too odd, too slow, or too uncommercial. The studio even cut the film down drastically, burying it as a B picture. For years, the full version was thought lost, Sex 0.05, until rediscovered and restored, helping it gain recognition as a masterpiece. Today, The Wicker Man is celebrated as one of the greatest folk horror films ever made. Its influence is everywhere, from Ari Aster's Midsommar to countless stories of isolated communities and their dark rituals. Christopher Lee himself called it the best role of his career, and horror fans agree. Why does it still terrify today? Because it feels real. Because it suggests that evil doesn't always hide in shadows or monsters, but in smiling faces and beautiful songs. Because it shows how faith, whether Christian or pagan, can consume lives completely. Watching Howie burn inside the Wicker Man is unforgettable, not just as horror, but as a study of belief, sacrifice, and inevitability. And if this folk ritual left you shaken, the next forgotten nightmare will turn grief and loss into something just as haunting, hidden in the canals of Venice. Number 5. Don't Look Now, 1973. Some horror films attack with blood, others with monsters, but Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now unsettles in a quieter, more insidious way. Released in 1973, it remains one of the most haunting films about grief ever made. The story follows John and Laura Baxter, played by Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, a married couple devastated by the drowning of their young daughter. Seeking escape, they move to Venice, where John takes work restoring an ancient church. But grief lingers, and soon, strange things begin to happen. Laura meets two elderly sisters, one of whom claims to be psychic. She insists their dead daughter is trying to reach them, warning of danger. John dismisses it, but he begins to see visions. A small figure in a red coat, darting through the foggy streets and twisting canals of Venice. The same red coat their daughter wore when she died. Road directs with a dreamlike style. Scenes cut unexpectedly, time feels fractured, and past and future seem to overlap. The atmosphere of Venice adds to the dread. The city is beautiful but decaying, full of shadows and labyrinthine alleys where danger could lurk around every corner. The performances are devastating. Sutherland portrays John as rational but deeply haunted, while Christie gives Laura both fragility and hope. Their chemistry feels painfully real, especially in the film's famous love scene, which shocked audiences with its intimacy. But it's the ending that cements Don't Look Now as unforgettable. After chasing the figure in the red coat through Venice, believing it to be his daughter's spirit, John finally catches up. Instead of a child, he is confronted by a grotesque dwarf killer who slashes his throat, fulfilling the psychic's prophecy. His visions were not warnings to save others, but premonitions of his own death. Critics were stunned. Some praised it as a masterpiece of psychological horror. #meta sex 0.05, while others called it pretentious or too artful for mainstream audiences. Over time, however, its reputation soared. It is now considered one of the greatest British horror films of all time, celebrated for its unique style and emotional depth. What makes it terrifying is not just the murder at the end, but the sense of fate running throughout. The idea that grief blinds us and drags us toward our doom. Why does it still terrify today? Because everyone knows the pain of loss, and Don't Look Now weaponizes that pain. It reminds us that grief twists our vision, that hope can become a trap, and that sometimes the thing we chase in the dark isn't salvation, but destruction. Watching John's final realization as the red coat turns and the blade flashes is like watching grief itself strike the killing blow. And if Venice haunted you with shadows of loss, the next forgotten horror leads us into a haunted house powered not by ghosts of the past, but by science gone horribly wrong. Number 4. The Legend of Hell House, 1973. When audiences think of haunted house movies, they usually remember The Haunting or the Amityville Horror, but in 1973, John Houff directed one of the most chilling ghost stories ever filmed, The Legend of Hell House. Based on Richard Matheson's novel Hell House, the film brought together science, the supernatural, and sheer terror in a way that still resonates. The story begins with a wealthy man hiring a team to investigate the notorious Belasco House, known as the Mount Everest of haunted houses. The team includes a physicist, played by Clive Revill, who believes science can explain the paranormal, along with his wife, played by Gail Honeycutt, and 2 mediums, one of them portrayed by Pamela Franklin. Together, they enter the mansion, hoping to unlock its secrets and survive the week inside. The house itself is almost a character. Dark hallways, locked rooms, and a sinister atmosphere make every scene feel suffocating. The spirit that haunts it is said to be Emmerich Belasco, a sadistic millionaire whose life was filled with debauchery, cruelty, and murder. Even in death, his presence dominates the house, corrupting anyone who dares to enter. The film is filled with disturbing set pieces, doors slam shut with no warning, objects fly across rooms, cold spots drain the life from characters, seances turn violent as unseen forces lash out. One particularly shocking moment involves a possessed character lashing into violent sexual behavior, leaving the others shaken and horrified. Houff directs with precision, balancing gothic atmosphere with raw shocks. The cinematography keeps the viewer constantly off guard, never sure what might leap from the shadows. The cast sells the terror. Pamela Franklin as Florence Tanner, the spiritual medium, gives one of the strongest performances of her career, torn between her faith and the crushing weight of the house's evil. Roddy McDowall as Ben Fisher, the only survivor of a previous expedition, brings quiet intensity to his role. He knows the danger firsthand and his fear is palpable. Critics were mixed when the film was released. Some dismissed it as too exploitative, too graphic compared to earlier haunted house tales. Others admired its boldness, praising it as one of the most frightening ghost stories of the decade. Over time, however, it earned respect as a cult classic, its influence echoing in later supernatural horror. What makes The Legend of Hell House terrifying even now is the collision of logic and the unexplainable. The scientists bring machines, theories, and rational explanations, but none of it stops the rage of the house. In the end, it's not science that conquers the haunting, but the confrontation of Belasco's twisted spirit. Why does it still terrify today? Because it suggests that evil leaves a stain too deep for reason to clean, because the walls of Hell House feel alive, pulsing with the crimes of the past. And because once you step inside, no amount of knowledge can save you. And if this haunted mansion shook your faith in science, the next forgotten horror takes us back to the countryside, where the devil himself is said to have left his mark. Number 3. The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. Before folk horror became a recognized genre, there was a strange British film that helped define it. Directed by Piers Haggard, The Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971 combined period drama, rural superstition, and creeping evil into something unforgettable. The story begins when a farmer ploughing his field uncovers a deformed skull, covered in fur and claws. From that moment on, darkness spreads through the village. Teenagers begin to act strangely, possessed by an unseen force. They whisper, form secret gatherings, and fall under the influence of something demonic. The horror grows slowly but relentlessly. Young villagers sprout patches of animal-like skin. They cut away the flesh of others to complete a monstrous resurrection. Soon, they are conducting pagan rituals, sacrificing their peers to restore the devil's body piece by piece. Linda Hayden, playing the seductive Angel Blake, gives a chilling performance as the ringleader of the possessed youth. Her calm voice and cold eyes make her both alluring and terrifying. Opposite her stands Patrick Wymark as the judge, a man of reason forced to confront the irrational horror consuming his community. The film is filled with eerie set pieces. A girl screams as fur grows from her back. A group of children laugh as they cut into their friend's skin. A black mass is performed in the woods, with victims stripped and humiliated before being slaughtered. These images shocked audiences in the early 70s, not just for their brutality, but for the way they corrupted the innocence of youth. Critics at the time were unsettled. Some dismissed it as exploitation dressed up in period costumes, but others recognized it as something new, a bridge between gothic horror and modern folk terror. Piers Haggard later admitted much of the story was improvised, yet the rawness only added to its power. Over time, The Blood on Satan's Claw became a cornerstone of folk horror. Often alongside The Wicker Man and Witchfinder General, it captured the fear of rural isolation, the danger of superstition, and the idea that evil doesn't just arrive, it grows, infecting people from within. What makes it terrifying even now is its atmosphere of corruption. The countryside looks idyllic, yet beneath the fields and woods lies something foul. The children, who should represent purity, become agents of the devil, and the adults, powerless and confused, watch as their world collapses into chaos. Why does it still terrify today? Because it shows how fragile order is, how quickly a community can fall to hysteria and evil when confronted with the unexplainable. Because its imagery for growing from human flesh, children chanting in the woods, remains deeply unsettling. And because it reminds us that horror doesn't just come from outside forces, but from the darkness waiting to bloom inside ordinary people. And if this tale of rural possession left you shaken, the next forgotten nightmare takes us to Spain, where a remote school hides secrets that turn innocence into terror. Number 2. The House That Screamed, 1971. Before the slasher craze of the late 70s, Spain delivered a gothic horror that felt years ahead of its time. Directed by Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, The House That Screamed tells the story of an exclusive boarding school for troubled girls, hidden away in the countryside, where discipline is strict and punishments are cruel. Lily Palmer stars as the headmistress, a cold and authoritarian woman who rules the school with an iron grip. At first, the horror seems to come from her oppressive methods, the brutal lessons, the fear instilled in the students. But soon, girls begin to disappear, one by one, with no explanation. Whispers spread through the dorms. Is someone sneaking out? Is the school hiding a dark secret? Serrador builds tension slowly, using the claustrophobic hallways, the echo of footsteps, and the growing paranoia among the girls. The atmosphere feels oppressive, and the strict uniforms and rigid order make every break in discipline feel dangerous. Then the murders begin. A girl lured away in the night, a scream echoing through the halls, a body hidden before anyone can discover it. Unlike many horror films of its era, The House That Screamed doesn't rely on jump scares. It focuses on dread, on the slow realization that something terrible is lurking just beyond the walls. And when the truth is finally revealed, it's shocking. The killer is the headmistress's own son, hidden away in the attic, a disturbed young man desperate to create the perfect woman by assembling pieces of the missing girls. It's a grisly twist that foreshadows later slashers like Psycho 2 and Pieces, and it left audiences stunned. Critics in Spain were divided, some shocked by the violence and themes, others praising its artistry. Internationally, the film was cut and censored, which kept it from reaching wider recognition, but horror fans who discovered it admired its boldness. Over the years, it built a reputation as a cult classic, especially among those studying the roots of slasher cinema. What makes The House That Screamed terrifying today is how modern it feels. The structure of the story, an isolated institution, young victims, a hidden killer, predates the tropes that would dominate horror years later. Its gothic visuals, combined with the brutality of the murders, make it feel like a bridge between old European horror and the coming American slasher wave. And the twist ending still packs a punch, reminding us that horror often hides in the most respectable places. Why does it still terrify? Because it takes a place meant for education and safety and turns it into a prison of fear. Because it suggests that authority itself can mask corruption. And because the final revelation that a mother would protect a monster in her own home is both tragic and chilling. And if you thought this tale of hidden evil was shocking, our final forgotten horror brings us to a quiet, eerie film that whispers instead of screams. A story of madness and mystery that still unsettles half a century later. Number 1. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. Some horror films scream their terror, but Let's Scare Jessica to Death whispers it, slowly pulling you into madness until you can't tell what's real and what's not. Directed by John Hancock in 1971, this quiet, eerie film has become one of the most unsettling psychological horrors of its era. The story follows Jessica, played by Zora Lampert, a fragile woman recently released from a mental institution. Seeking peace, she and her husband move to an old farmhouse in the countryside, hoping for a fresh start. But the house carries shadows, and Jessica begins to hear voices, see strange figures, and feel an oppressive presence around her. Soon, a mysterious young woman named Emily appears, claiming to be a drifter. Jessica's husband and friends welcome her, but Jessica feels something is wrong. Emily is alluring, manipulative, and possibly not human at all. Rumors of a woman who drowned near the property, a vampire-like figure haunting the town, make Jessica question whether Emily is real or a ghostly predator feeding on her sanity. What makes the film terrifying is its ambiguity. Almost every scene could be a hallucination or reality. Is Jessica relapsing into mental illness, or is she the only one who sees the truth? The uncertainty leaves the viewer as unsettled as the protagonist, trapped in a fog of paranoia. Zora Lampert delivers a heartbreaking performance. Her nervous energy, whispered lines, and haunted eyes make Jessica painfully sympathetic. You want to believe her, but the film constantly undercuts her perception, forcing you to doubt everything. The cinematography heightens the dread. Misty lakes, creaking houses, and quiet rural landscapes feel oppressive, as if nature itself is conspiring against Jessica. The sound design whispers, echoes, faint music in the distance creates a constant sense of unease. When violence does strike, it's sudden and jarring, breaking the stillness with shocking force. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of the film. Some dismissed it as too slow, too strange, but others praised its haunting atmosphere and psychological depth. Over the years, it gained cult status, often cited as one of the most underrated American horror films of the 1970s. Modern audiences recognize it as a precursor to psychological horror like The Witch or Hereditary, where the line between supernatural and mental collapse blurs completely. Why does it still terrify today? Because it captures the fear of losing control of your own mind. Because it forces you to live inside Jessica's fragile perspective, where every shadow could be a ghost and every friend could be an enemy. And because in the end, whether Emily is real or imagined doesn't matter. The terror is that no one believes Jessica, and she may be trapped in madness forever. Let's Scare Jessica to Death doesn't shock with gore or spectacle. It unsettles with silence, paranoia, and despair, and that makes it linger long after the credits roll. So there you have it, 15 forgotten horror films from the 1970s that still terrify today. They may not have the fame of The Exorcist or Halloween, but each of them carries a unique nightmare. Some whisper with psychological dread, others scream with gore and spectacle, and a few simply leave you unsettled with images you can never erase. What ties them together is the decade they came from, a wild and fearless era when horror was pushing boundaries, experimenting with style, and giving us visions that were often too strange for the mainstream. That's why many of these films slipped through the cracks. They were too odd, too disturbing, or too unconventional to find mass audiences at the time. But that's also why they remain powerful. Watching them today feels like uncovering hidden relics, time capsules of pure dread waiting to be rediscovered. Maybe you've seen some of these, maybe you haven't, but if you love horror, each one is worth your time. Which of these forgotten nightmares shocked you the most? And which one do you think deserves to be remembered alongside the classics? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more countdowns like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe because the past is full of horrors still waiting to be uncovered.